In the Soviet Union, home didn't begin with warmth. It began with concrete, gray, cold, uniform. On the edge of every city, these blocks rose like silent monuments to the state's promise, a private space for every citizen. But behind the identical facades and thin walls, life told a different story. A room wasn't just a room. It was a kitchen, a bedroom, a war zone, a sanctuary. 10 stories of strangers packed together with no elevators, no privacy, and no choice. From the peeling stairwells to the sacred living room rug, every detail was shaped by scarcity, policy, and survival. This wasn't just where people lived. This was where the Soviet system lived with them. They stood like monoliths across the Soviet Union, tall, gray, silent, row after row of concrete apartment blocks, rising from the frozen ground like relics of some unfinished future. From Vladivostok to Kyiv, they looked the same. Prefabricated panels bolted into place, sharp corners, identical windows lined up like soldiers. No balconies, or, if there were, they were rusted metal cages barely big enough for a bucket. No ornamentation, no individuality, just utility. That was the point. These buildings weren't designed to please the eye. They were built to house the masses. Efficient, uniform, disposable. To an outsider, they all blended together. One block was indistinguishable from the next. But to those who lived inside them, each one had its own mood, its own peculiarities. The way the wind whistled through cracked stairwells, the creaking of a specific floorboard, the neighbor's radio leaking through the concrete like a ghost. These buildings weren't elegant. They were functional, brutal, and cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. They were part of a massive top-down plan to solve the Soviet housing crisis. And in a way, they did. Millions of people were moved out of communal barracks and into their own apartments. It was considered progress. But it was progress poured from a mold. Most of the structures were made using a method called Khrushchevka, after the leader who championed them. They were cheap, fast, and standardized, built not for comfort, but for quotas. A building could go up in weeks. The panels were made in giant factories and trucked in on flatbeds. Construction was sometimes so rushed that pieces didn't fit properly. Gaps were filled with insulation and prayers. Windows leaked. Walls cracked, doors warped in the rain. But no one complained. It was still a private space, a room of your own, which for many was already a revolution. Outside, the buildings were often surrounded by uneven footpaths and patches of dirt. The occasional playground, a rusty slide, a concrete sandbox. Laundry lines stretched between balconies like improvised flags. In winter, everything was coated in ice. In spring, mud. In summer, dust. But always, the block stood firm, like a silent observer of the lives unfolding inside. There were no elevators above the 5th floor. It was policy. Anything higher, and you climbed. Old women carried sacks of potatoes step by step. Children lugged buckets of coal. The stairwells were dark, lit by a single bulb if it hadn't burned out. The smell, a mixture of boiled cabbage, damp concrete, and tobacco, was permanent. People passed one another without speaking, just a nod, just a grunt. Doors were steel, bolted, often double-locked. Security came from isolation. And yet, for all its bleakness, there was something deeply Soviet about the apartment block. It was a physical expression of the system, collective, harsh, unavoidable. It reminded everyone of their place. You didn't decorate the outside. You didn't repaint the walls. You didn't stand out. You existed quietly inside your assigned square of concrete, among hundreds of others doing the same. It was more than a building. It was ideology, stacked 10 stories high. The first thing that greeted you upon entering a Soviet apartment block wasn't warmth or welcome. It was the stairwell. A dim, echoing shaft of chipped concrete and rusted metal where the paint peeled in long, curling strips from the walls. The color was always the same. A dull, institutional green halfway up the wall, then stained white above, like someone had once tried to make it brighter and gave up. The air hung heavy with smells that never left. Boiled cabbage, sour sweat, old tobacco, damp newspaper. Every step echoed, every voice carried. Nothing was private. Mailboxes lined the entrance wall like dented metal mouths, many of them broken or pried open. Numbers were hand-painted, scratched off, then rewritten. Flyers from state committees and local shops hung crookedly on corkboards no one read, held in place by ancient thumbtacks or chewed gum. The floor tiles were cracked, often missing entirely. You learned early which ones to avoid so your foot wouldn't sink into the cement beneath. In some buildings, especially the older ones, the stairwell was shared by multiple families. The landings became extensions of private space. People kept boots outside their doors. A stool here, a broken cabinet there, holding jars, tools, a radio no one used anymore. It was unofficial storage, claimed by tradition, not permission. Shoes lined up neatly. Slippers waited at the door. Umbrellas dripped onto doormats stitched by hand 20 years earlier. The stairwell was not quite home, but it wasn't entirely public either. It existed in between. The lighting was always poor. A single bulb hung at the ceiling's center, encased in a wire cage to keep children, or drunks, from smashing it. Often it didn't work. People carried flashlights in winter, or simply memorized the steps. If you lived on the 4th or 5th floor, you developed a rhythm to the climb. You counted your breaths. You cursed every extra bag. And if you lived higher, the 6th, 7th, 8th floor, then you knew each landing like a chapter. The broken tile with the bent nail, the water stain shaped like a bear, the spot where the light sometimes flickered. These details became part of the journey. Doors varied. Some were bare wood, others covered in quilted leatherette, a kind of DIY luxury. Peepholes were standard. Double locks even more so. Security wasn't just about theft. It was about control. Who came in, who left, who lingered. Neighbors watched. Not always with suspicion, but always with attention. The stairwell taught you that you were never truly alone. And through it all came the sounds. A baby crying from 3 floors up. The creak of footsteps at midnight. A couple arguing softly behind a steel door. Radios playing wartime songs or foreign jazz. The communal stairwell didn't just connect apartments. It connected lives. Through noise, through scent, through worn handrails and shared glances. It was the artery of the Soviet home. Unchanging, uninviting, but undeniably alive. The kitchen was never just a kitchen. It was the nerve center of the Soviet apartment. A battleground of routine. A place where smells lingered and tempers quietly simmered. In communal flats, it was shared territory. 4, 5, sometimes 7 families using the same stove, the same chipped sink, the same greasy pan that no one admitted owning. At the start of the day, you might find yourself in line not for bread, but for the kettle. Boiling water became strategy. Timing mattered. Gas burners clicked on with a sputter, and whoever claimed one first had temporary power. The others waited, watched, and judged. Even in single-family flats, the kitchen was too small. You could stretch your arms and touch both walls. The table often folded into the wall or doubled as a cutting board. Pots were enamel, battered, stained. The wallpaper peeled where steam had worn it down year after year. A dangling bulb lit everything in stark yellow. The fridge, if you had one, moaned through the night like an old man in his sleep. Most didn't trust it. Meat was stored on the balcony in winter, wrapped in newspaper and wedged between flower pots. And still, it was the most alive room in the house. This was where news was whispered, where neighbors leaned in and lowered their voices. Tea was poured endlessly, glass cups in metal pod stakanniks. Sugar cubes were rationed. Bread was cut thin. A guest always meant another plate, even if there was nothing to serve. People talked with their elbows on the table, their backs to the drafty window, and cigarettes burned low in the ashtray between them. The radio played quietly from a shelf, humming speeches or folk songs between hisses of static. Arguments often started here. Whose turn was it to clean the stove? Who used up all the salt? Who took the neighbor's eggs without asking? But in between the tension were moments of quiet unity. Someone offering soup, someone else sharing pickles from a hidden jar. These weren't luxuries. These were gestures of survival. The kitchen became a theater of unspoken rules. Don't take, don't ask, don't make noise after 10. But also, offer, nod, leave a clean spoon. There were codes, unwritten but known. If you walked in and saw someone crying over a teacup, you didn't ask why. If someone had meat on a random Tuesday, you didn't mention it. And if someone offered you a piece of sausage, you accepted it. Always. Even if you weren't hungry. Refusing was an insult. Accepting was respect. In the end, the Soviet kitchen was more than a room for cooking. It was the country, boiled down to a few square meters. Scarcity, resentment, generosity, rumor, politics, heat. It was where life condensed, thick and full of noise, into a space barely big enough for 3 chairs and a gas flame. It wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. Everything that happened in the Soviet apartment started and ended there, with a kettle, a crust of bread, and the door slightly ajar. It was called the living room, but that word didn't quite fit. In a Soviet apartment, it was the everything room. During the day, it looked almost grand. A polished wall unit stretching from floor to ceiling, filled with glassware that no one touched, books no one read, and souvenirs from somewhere no one had been. A patterned rug hung proudly on the wall, not for insulation, though it helped, but for decoration. A symbol of taste, of culture, of having made it. In front of it sat a couch that wasn't really a couch. It was a bed, folded by day, unfolded by night. 1,000 Soviet dreams lived and died on those cushions. The table in the center was collapsible. It could stretch for guests or shrink for tea. On its surface were burn marks from hot pans and the faint outline of past celebrations. Birthdays, New Year's, silent toasts to things that couldn't be said out loud. A small TV stood in the corner like a domestic deity, flickering black and white images from a state-approved world. Its presence dictated the room's layout. All chairs faced it. All conversations paused for the news. When there was nothing on, it hummed, a soft, electric heartbeat. There was no space to waste. Every corner served a purpose. A baby crib squeezed beside a wardrobe, a sewing machine near the window, a fish tank that hadn't seen a fish in years but still held murky water. Photographs of families stood in silver frames, usually faded, always serious. No one smiled in those portraits. Smiling wasn't practical. It wasn't how you survived. At night, the transformation began. Cushions came off. The couch was pulled forward. Blankets, folded in the closet behind the glass door, were laid out. Pillows emerged from under the table. A bed was made, not just for one, but sometimes for 2 or 3. Privacy didn't exist. The room was shared, its roles switched fluidly. A child's play area by morning, a dining hall at lunch, a bedroom by midnight. Lives stacked on top of each other, just like the buildings they lived in. Visitors always came here first. You didn't bring people into the kitchen unless they were trusted. The living room was for presentation, even if the carpet smelled faintly of vinegar, even if the couch springs creaked under every movement. A samovar might sit proudly on a doily-covered table, untouched for years. It was a theater stage, and the performance was domestic dignity. No one called it multifunctional. It simply had to be. You made it work. A child did homework in one corner, while a grandfather listened to the radio in another. A father shaved near the mirror, while the mother ironed clothes on the floor. Everything happened in parallel, always overlapping, always in motion. The room was small, but the life inside it was not. This was not just a living room, it was the heart of the Soviet apartment. Cramped, cluttered, worn, but always beating. It held everyone. It held everything. And somehow, it held together. The furniture didn't move. It didn't change. It didn't rotate with the seasons or follow trends. In a Soviet apartment, furniture was forever. Heavy, dark, and immovable. Not just physically, but psychologically. It came into your life like an arranged marriage and stayed until the end. Most pieces were mass-produced in state-run factories. You didn't choose them. You waited for them. Sometimes for months, sometimes for years. You signed up on a list, handed over your vouchers, and hoped the delivery truck wouldn't forget your building. When it arrived, it brought the same thing it brought to everyone else. The centerpiece was the wall unit. Stenka. It was enormous. It took up the entire wall, from floor to ceiling, usually in glossy imitation wood veneer. It smelled like lacquer and glue, even decades later. It had compartments for everything. Books, clothes, liquor, documents, china. Behind its glass panels sat crystal glasses and decorative plates, all polished but untouched. Some were wedding gifts, others were smuggled in from East Germany. No one ever drank from them. They were for display only, symbols of status in a world with little to display. Next came the armchairs, boxy, brown, and dense like concrete. They didn't invite you to sit, they tolerated it. Their cushions sank slowly over the years, absorbing the weight of every evening spent in silence or low conversation. The upholstery never matched anything else in the room, but that didn't matter. You didn't throw them away. You reupholstered them, or covered them with patterned blankets, sometimes crochet, sometimes scratchy wool. Those blankets too stayed forever. Beds were often hidden, fold-out couches, creaky mechanisms, cushions that never fit back quite right. By day they were seating. By night, sleeping quarters. The transformation was a ritual. Pillows were pulled from above the wardrobe, where they rested inside yellowing pillowcases. Blankets stored in plastic bags filled the room with a faint smell of age. And in the morning, everything was packed away again, as if the night had never happened. Storage was sacred. Wardrobes that reached the ceiling, filled with coats, linens, photo albums, boxes of nothing, just in case. Drawers that held sewing kits, expired coupons, old letters, half spools of thread, rubber bands from the 70s. You never knew what to throw out. You never knew what might be needed again. A broken lamp. A shoelace. A knob that no longer matched anything. The past was too fragile to discard. There were no catalogs, no redesigns, no reinvention. If something broke, you fixed it. If you couldn't fix it, you lived around it. Furniture was not for expression, it was for function. And it was permanent. Rooms weren't curated. They were inherited, one piece at a time. A table from your parents, a mirror from a friend, a chipped nightstand someone left behind. All of it mismatched. All of it necessary. In Western homes, furniture could reflect taste. In the Soviet home, it reflected endurance. What you had, you kept. What you kept, you respected. Because getting something new wasn't about money. It was about waiting, knowing someone, and being lucky. And even then, it would look exactly like your neighbor's. Identity didn't come from style. It came from how well you made it all last. The bathroom was not a place for comfort. It was a place for necessity. Small, cold, and usually damp. In a Soviet apartment, the bathroom was either split into two separate rooms, one for the toilet, one for the bath, or crammed into a single tight space that barely allowed you to turn around. The walls were tiled in pale colors that had long since faded. The grout was dark. The mirror was small and always fogged. A metal shelf above the sink held a toothbrush in a cracked plastic cup, a dull razor, and a half-used bar of soap that smelled like iron and old hospitals. Toilet paper was rationed, if it existed at all. Most used cut-up newspapers, stacked neatly beside the toilet in makeshift holders. The toilet itself was often old, noisy, sometimes shaky. In communal flats, it might be shared between families. The lock never worked properly. Etiquette was enforced through shame and routine. You cleaned it when it was your turn. If you didn't, someone would knock on your door and say nothing, just stare. And then there were the machines, if you were lucky enough to have one. The Soviet washing machine wasn't really a machine in the Western sense. It was a bucket-shaped contraption with a paddle that swirled back and forth. No rinse cycle, no spin. Just soap, water, and luck. Clothes were hung on wires stretched across the bathroom, dripping for hours, or on radiators that hissed when the heat came on in winter. The radiator paint peeled, the pipes clanged. It was all functional, all ancient. Privacy didn't exist. Sounds carried through the plumbing. A neighbor flushing on the 5th floor could be heard on the 2nd. The pipes groaned like living things. If someone ran water elsewhere in the building, yours might vanish or turn cold mid-rinse. Baths were scheduled. Children were washed first. Guests, if trusted, were offered the tub as a gesture of great hospitality. The bathroom wasn't just a space. It was a system of workarounds. You learned to be fast, to be quiet, to expect nothing and adapt to everything. The Soviet state promised a better life. The bathroom quietly reminded everyone that survival was still the primary goal. You could keep it clean. You could make it smell like lemon-scented cleaner if you were lucky. But you could never make it luxurious. It simply wasn't built for that. It was built to work. Just enough. You never really lived alone in a Soviet apartment. Even when the door was closed, even when the lights were off and the curtains drawn, you were never truly isolated. The walls were too thin. The plumbing too loud. The air too shared. Sounds traveled effortlessly. Footsteps, whispers, coughing, clinking dishes. Life bled through plaster and concrete like water through a sponge. You heard your neighbors' lives, and they heard yours. Privacy didn't exist. It was a fiction you learned to stop believing in. In the morning, you might be woken not by your own alarm, but by the neighbor's radio clicking on in the next flat, a tinny voice reading news headlines, or by the sharp rhythm of a broom handle banging on the ceiling, the universal Soviet signal to keep it down. Children cried in the stairwell. Someone practiced accordion in apartment 3B. A man upstairs shaved to military marches. Someone downstairs cursed at the water pressure. Everyone lived close, too close, and the walls kept no secrets. Arguments weren't private. You heard them word for word. A couple fighting about money, about relatives, about a clogged toilet. And when the silence came afterward, it felt louder than the shouting. Laughter also traveled, deep, familiar, sometimes bitter. Drunken voices floated in late at night. Toasts shouted too loudly. Glasses clinked. Then a chair scraped, a door slammed, a toilet flushed. All of it pieced together into a soundscape that no one invited, but everyone knew by heart. The pipes groaned like tired lungs. Water surged through them unpredictably, rushing and fading with no warning. You could track your neighbor's routine by when the tap sputtered or the shower stopped. Sometimes voices echoed through the plumbing, warped, underwater conversations from 2 floors above. If you listened, you could hear stories not meant for you. You could piece together lives, and yet, no one ever admitted to listening. In the kitchen, voices dropped to whispers, especially when certain topics came up. Politics, work, the party. Gossip wasn't just risky, it was inevitable. You couldn't help but overhear. You couldn't help but wonder who else was overhearing you. Paranoia settled in like dust, quiet glances through peepholes. Doors opened just a crack. Even inside your own walls, you moved carefully. You didn't want to be the one people talked about, or worse, reported. Despite it all, there was a strange intimacy to it. You knew your neighbors in ways you never discussed. You knew their habits, their rhythms, their tempers. You heard their joys, their griefs, their secrets, a baby's first cry, a husband's last breath. A song hummed absent-mindedly while folding laundry. You knew when someone had guests. You knew when someone was alone too long. The walls were thin, but the lives behind them were full. The Soviet apartment was a shared structure, not just in architecture, but in experience. Everyone lived inside everyone else's orbit. You adapted. You lowered your voice. You played the radio just loud enough to drown out the neighbors, but never too loud to annoy them. You learned to live quietly, even when surrounded by noise. In the corner, a little icon might hang, quiet, unacknowledged, but watched. Below it, a shelf of books passed down through generations, their pages yellowed and spines creased. The wallpaper was peeling, but no one tore it down. It stayed because it had always been there, because the new kind was either unavailable or too expensive or simply unnecessary. The same went for the curtains, the armchairs, the kitchen tiles. Things weren't replaced, they were lived with. Children grew up in these spaces, learned to walk in narrow hallways, played beneath the table while adults smoked and talked. A wedding was celebrated in the same room where a funeral was mourned. Life events compressed into one tight frame, replayed over and over against the same backdrop. When someone got a new appliance, a television, a fridge, even a rug, it wasn't just a household change. It was an event. Neighbors came to see. Tea was served. People nodded, impressed. It meant something. People got creative. A broken radio was turned into a shelf. A crate became a stool. A tablecloth doubled as a curtain. Every item had three purposes, and every corner had been used 100 different ways. In a world that rarely gave more, people learned to stretch meaning from what little they had. The apartment might not have offered luxury, but it offered something else: stability. A known shape, a known smell, a known silence at night. For all the noise of the stairwells, for all the shortages and shadows and shared walls, this was still home. People returned to these spaces with arms full of groceries or with empty hands. They turned keys in metal doors. They exhaled. Inside, it was theirs. It didn't matter that the paint flaked, or that the couch creaked, or that the lights flickered. What mattered was that it was familiar. A fortress of memory built inside walls that had seen everything and forgotten nothing. It wasn't perfect, but it was lived in, and it was real.